Hello again. Welcome to this first live webinar today from Carbon Consult Group on Canada-EU free trade deal, how to make the most of it by staying on top of EU's challenging environmental regulations. Just as a quick disclaimer and reminder, let me just get back to the slide. This material is not intended to be relied upon as provisions, so just be reminded that there's no warranty of accuracy or reliability that is given, and no responsibility arising in any other ways for our errors or omission. You'll be able to read a little bit more about this information once we publish the webinar on our live website. My name is Jean Paquin. I'm going to be your host today, and I'm going to be with Mr. Alex Iordan, our project manager. We're welcoming you for the live webinar series on environmental compliance. It is the first of a series, and that series is going to be recorded for quality and archiving purposes. This live webinar is entitled, as I said, Canada's EU Free Trade Deal and how to make the most of it by staying on top of EU's challenging environmental regulations. And it will last for around 45 minutes and will include about 10 to 15 minutes of questions at the end of the webinar. Please ask your questions anytime using the Q&A box provided to you at the top or at the bottom, depending on the setup on your screen. And we will try to answer all questions at the end of the webinar. Since we have a lot of participants today online and perhaps little time to answer them all, we will follow up by sending you a Q&A feedback including most relevant questions and answer. With me today from Carbon Consult Group is our expert, Alex Iordan, who has long-standing expertise in environmental affairs. Alex has led the translation of complex regulations into bite-sized business needs and the implementation of a product compliance management program at Canada's main aircraft manufacturer. Hello, Alex.
Hello, Jean. Thank you so much for inviting me today. It is a pleasure to come here to discuss this important and very relevant subject today.
Fantastic. Let's dive into the core of the topic. And Alex, again, I'm very proud to have you here today because I know we're going to be talking about a lot of relevant material with regards to the CETA free trade deal. So just to go on top with the new European-Canadian trade deal partnership now agreement finally signed, of course, that provides a wealth of opportunities for many Canadian manufacturers and organizations. Of course, with these opportunities, that also means there's a greater potential exposure to existing environmental regulations. So therefore, understanding the risks linked to environmental regulation is hopefully what we will try to achieve today with this webinar. The content of the webinar, of course, there'll be an introduction to the subject matter, and then we will be talking about the free trade deal and who benefits from it, and also the EU environmental legislation relevant to Canadian exporters. After this, we will, or Alex will be touching base on examples of key issues that Canadian exports could encounter, and also the legislative developments in course. The best practices will be discussed as well, and we'll, of course, have, as usual in our webinars, some very important takeaways for you. Okay, so next, I will talk very quickly, very briefly about the Carbon Consult Group because this is our first live webinar with you on the compliance, and we just want you to know who we are quickly. We're a Montreal-based consulting company and experts on environmental topics as well as greenhouse gas emissions management and strategy. We have activities across Canada and the US, in Europe, and we mostly deal with the manufacturing, electronics, aerospace, renewable energies, chemical, and transportation and finance sectors. So this expertise is rooted in the private sector and, of course, is Canadian dealt directly from Montreal and also from Ontario. So without further ado, I will pass along the next slide to our friend and our collaborator and expert, Mr. Alex Iordan, to explain to us the regulation and the risks associated with this new opportunity. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Jean. Again, I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm very pleased to talk to this lovely audience. As you said, we have a big audience today. So maybe I will just start with a quick note on risk management and how that is different basically from legal advice. So risk management is very much about looking the overall effects and impacts of a regulation compared to your bottom line. So that means going beyond just understanding how the regulations might apply to the company or the legal consequences, and going also further down in the weeds into understanding what is the overall business exposure, deciding whether to contact suppliers or customers, or how to track required product data. Basically, this is about understanding the total and overall impact that you can see because of an environmental regulation. So our webinar is having this view. So without further ado, let's get into the bit of the details. So first of all, an overview of the CETA free trade deal. So what is CETA? CETA means Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. It is a free trade deal between the European Union and Canada. And it has just been ratified by the EU Parliament and will be entering into force provisionally in the spring 2017. What does it really bring to Canadian exporters? Well, first of all, there will be a facilitation of customs and trade activities, and there will also be an opening of the European public market to Canadian companies. This will definitely improve the access for our national manufacturers and exporters. And maybe most importantly, the EU will eliminate import taxes on up to 99% of the Canadian goods we export there. So as a takeaway, CETA is really seen and expected to be highly beneficial to Canadian exporters in the following sectors, specifically chemicals, plastics, industrial, and telecom equipment. And we believe we have many of you on our webinar today. So a quick note right now about the key EU environmental legislation. So I'm not going to go into details. Some of you are very aware, some of you are maybe less aware, but I just want to list them right now as we will refer to them a bit later. One of the first and most important pieces of legislation is the ROS Directive, which stands for Restriction of Hazardous Substances in Electrical and Electronic Equipment. So as the title says, it really applies mainly to electronics and the electronic sector with a certain amount of out-of-scope sectors or exemptions. Again, if you want to know more, know that each piece of legislation is different in terms of scope and requirements, and exclusions and exemptions may apply to you. So you should take a look more in depth. A second piece is the REACH regulation. REACH stands for Registration, Evaluation, Authorization, Restrictions of Chemicals. And what is important is that it applies both to chemical products and chemicals and manufactured items that might contain chemicals in their, and probably will contain chemicals in their composition. A third piece of regulation that is important, but maybe less well known, is the biocidal products regulation. This regulation applies both to chemical products and manufactured items, and has a very specific focus on substances that may be contained in these products that have a biocidal action. An anti-germ, antibacterial action. I'm particularly focusing on this one just because it's quite recent, and it is not always very straightforward to understand that this type of products are found in the end items you might be exporting. So we will talk a bit more on that later. Okay, so one of the questions basically that we can ask ourselves is how exactly are these environmental requirements impacting Canadian exporters? There are different ways, and the differences are quite wide, and sometimes it's a bit subtle to understand. The first category of impact is really legal obligations. For instance, under ROSS, non-EU manufacturers, although they are not based in the EU, they therefore have to ensure their exported goods are compliant. Another category is the fact that exporters will have contractual obligations towards their customers, and as such, customers may require support to ensure the products they buy and import into the EU are compliant. It is worth noting that in most cases, it is the customers who are responsible to ensure compliance with regulations. So it is important to support them as exporters. A third way that exporters are impacted is in the bidding process. So what we've seen is that more and more prospective customers from Europe, for instance, ask for proof of compliance as part of the bidding process. So when you make your proposal to this prospective customer, you may be asked to provide more detailed information on your compliance. And lastly, there is the fact that we will see increased border controls, where customs authorities may require proof of compliance for imported goods. So the bottom line here is that Canadian exporters face a variety of risks, and they have to be both identifying and, if possible, proactively managing them. So let's see a couple of examples that we've put together, considering the kind of the kind of folks who are on the phone. So we have an example here for a coating. It is something that actually was inspired by an experience of mine in the aerospace industry, but basically can be it is an example that can be used for any type of chemical product. So what kind of things could go wrong if not well addressed? So what can happen is that while Canadian manufacturers of chemical products would be entirely compliant with the regulations here in Canada, they may encounter several issues when the products are shipped to the EU. Namely, it is a possibility that some of the substances in the paint formulation, in this case, might not be compliant with the restrictions there, either under REACH or the biocides regulations. That is the case because REACH, and I want to emphasize that again, is restricting now more chemicals than are restricted in Canada, and the chemicals are different. Another way of impacting is that the substance in the paint formulation might be at risk of future restrictions, or that the safety data sheets, although compliant with the global harmonized system, is not entirely compliant with REACH. For instance, because there is no exposure scenarios, or the exposure scenarios are not complete enough. Third, lastly, the labeling and packaging might not also be compliant with REACH. Namely, pictograms are different sometimes in REACH than in Canada, so that can be something of an issue at that point. The key takeaway from this slide is that although they comply to Canadian norms, companies exporting chemicals to the EU may still face new risks. And this is something that has to be taken into consideration into a risk assessment. Now, another example, which is more adapted to manufactured goods, I take here the example of electronic and electric equipment, and to really portray the entire example, let's imagine that the product is actually shipped also in a packaging, like in this case a cardboard packaging. Now this is something that actually is happening quite a lot, and in this case there are several areas, and again very subtle, where issues can occur. The first area is that there may be substances that are restricted under REACH or RoHS in some cases in the subcomponents of the equipment. So we can talk about a keyboard, or we can talk about a component of the keyboard, or even a microchip or anything like that. If any of them contains a restricted substance above the authorized limits, that can jeopardize the whole the whole equipment, because the equipment will be uncompliant. The same example can occur also with packaging, and this is less well known. Sometimes packaging is, especially conventionally, had been treated with antibacterial substances, or has been treated with flame retardants, and those substances are very targeted in the EU for restrictions. So special attention has to be given to packaging. Another category of impacts is when there are needs to declare certain substances. For instance, the REACH candidate list substance, or as they are called, substances of very high concern. The requirement is for them to be disclosed to customers upon receival of the products in the EU, if those substances are above the legal threshold. And in many cases, and the legal threshold really applies to each one of the subcomponents. So in many cases, this type of substances might be overlooked if their concentration overall is very small, but in a given component, it is very high. And lastly, like as in the case of the paint, there is a need to label the products in compliance with applicable regulation. That means sometimes putting a CE marking on the product. So my conclusion here is that exporters of goods face the challenge basically of tracking what are the substances found in their subcomponents of the end product, for them to really understand their exposure to the environmental regulations and the risks. So a quick overview here about what are the consequences of non-compliance. I can mention that the first one that comes to mind, of course, are the penalties or criminal charges that are directly related to the regulations themselves, and these penalties could be incurred either by the exporters directly, such as in the case of RoHS, or by, in most cases, by their customers in the EU. So as we will see a bit later as well, there are audits regularly in the different countries, but also at the EU level, to understand what is the compliance of products on the EU market, and the importers, which are basically the customers of Canadian companies, are the ones who are getting audited most of the time. More subtle are the operational and financial losses that can also be incurred, be it because of delayed or blocked shipments of goods, or being because there have been missed business opportunities, or a decrease of interest from investors because the company has a poor reputation with compliance. I'm at the bottom of the slide. You see here an example we've put, which is pretty much a landmark case of non-compliance with restricted substances. The Sony Corporation a few years ago was found to ship products with a non-compliant substance, basically inside, and that case really resulted in a loss of an estimated of $150 million overall, including because of delayed or blocked shipments and all the other impacts. So what we hope you can take away from this slide is that overall cost of non-compliance usually outweighs the investments that are needed to ensure the due diligence in the first place. Okay. So in the next 3 slides, I just wanted to give you a taste of some of the recent developments that we would like you to be aware of, which are very important. And the first one is specifically impacting exporters of chemicals into the EU. What we are talking about is the REACH 2018 registration deadline for chemicals. Basically, the EU has been ongoing an exercise over the last 10 years of registering every chemical that is being used or commercialized on the EU market. And right now, the deadline in 2018 is for all the chemicals who are imported in the EU in a quantity of more than 1 ton per year. These chemicals have to be registered with the European authorities, and the dossier has to be submitted either by the company who is importing them into the EU, i.e. the customer, or by the Canadian exporters, in our case, through an appointing representative. It is to be noted that late registrants are at risk of not being allowed to import their products after May 2018. So it is very important for Canadian exporters to ensure that they have the correct registration of their substances by that deadline, and even to understand how the substances are used by their customers in the EU, so that the registration can be the most complete. Another development is the increase in REACH enforcement for manufactured goods. In 2015, the EU authorities announced a pilot project that would focus on enforcing the provisions for substances in manufactured goods. I make here just a parenthesis to say that in Europe, the authorities use the term articles to refer to manufactured goods. So you might see articles, you would understand it is manufactured goods. So closing this parenthesis, in 2017, EU authorities will focus on enforcing the requirements to disclose REACH candidate list substances or substances of very high concern when found above 0.1% weight over weight in articles in manufactured goods. So you really have to understand what your manufactured good contains in terms of subcomponents and what the subcomponents contain in terms of substances. And for those who have already done this exercise a few years ago, you may want to go back and look at that again, because as we will see a bit just afterwards, the way in which the regulation apply has changed recently. So bottom line, Canadian manufactured goods may see an increase in compliance controls, including at customs. So lastly, as I was mentioning a bit earlier, there is a change in the REACH guidance for manufactured goods. So in the past, the way the regulation was interpreted on day-to-day basis was that the concentration of a candidate list substance should be calculated at the end of at the end product level. That means if you want to know if a substance is above the legal threshold, you would calculate what the quantity of the substance in the entire end product is, and you would divide it by the weight of the entire product. Which meant if a substance was in very small quantity in the overall product, you would probably not need to declare it in most cases. However, something changed. In a few years, in 2015, September 2015, the EU Court of Justice ruled that actually REACH requirements would apply to each one of the subcomponents of a manufactured good. So for instance, if one of the nuts and bolts of a computer, let's say, contains cadmium above 0.1%, which is the threshold, then that substance has to be declared for the entire computer. And this is a very big change in terms of logistics and managing the whole process and of how you communicate with your supply chain as well. And that's why we recommend that Canadian exporters need to reassess the presence of candidate list substances in their products to see if the assessment is in line, new assessment is in line with the new guidelines. So before we conclude, maybe we want to also give you a few of the best practices that we've seen ourselves in the industry and where we've helped our customers with. Probably one of the first things to do that has also the highest impact is to really understand how the customers are using your product as much as possible. And linked to that, what kind of information the customers may need from you. In the case of customers of chemicals, they may need from you the right type of safety data sheets, and they may need from you help sometimes in the future to obtain an authorization maybe for those chemicals. In the case of manufactured goods, your customers might require and might need a declaration about what are the substances in your manufactured goods above the legal threshold, and more quantitative information on the quantities for them to ensure they are compliant. The second type of actions that we really recommend to do is to make sure that the inventory of chemicals you use in-house is complete, up to date, and it contains up-to-date safety data sheets in the most current format, and if possible also in a REACH compliant format. Then to understand how much of these in-house chemicals remain on your end product, if it's a manufactured good, and especially if it's a manufactured good. In the case of a chemical product, you usually do have that information already through the formulation. And lastly, it is important to assess what is your EU export, what are your EU export risks linked to these in-house chemicals. Are you going to be able to ship your chemicals there? Are you going to be, or is your customer going to be able to use the chemicals in Europe, and etc. And a third area of which is very important actually is to obtain, to contact and obtain the information on chemicals that are present in goods supplied to you by your suppliers. In the case of manufactured goods, the reality is that in most cases, most manufacturers are actually assembling parts they themselves bought somewhere else. So they really rely on the supply chain to understand what kind of chemicals are contained in those parts. And it is critical to do an assessment of the EU risks from those supply chain chemicals as well. With these three types of actions together, you will be able to have a good idea of the risks and the opportunities, and you will be really in a good position to manage them proactively and efficiently. Okay, so just a few examples very quickly. I'm not going to go too much into the detail here. The first example is the aerospace industry, aerospace and defense industry, who actually understood the need and the value of contacting the supply chain and obtaining the information on chemicals. and they understood that that process has to be made easier. This is why the International Aerospace Environmental Group was created and actually is working on developing a standard for chemical reporting in the aerospace and defense supply chain. This standard is called IPC 1754, and to our information, it is something that the aerospace and the major OEMs are looking forward to use in their supply chain. Some of you are in the aerospace and defense industry, so you might want to keep an eye on this one and understand really what will that be. I myself have been involved in the past closely with this, and I would be happy to answer any questions if you have any. A second example is most geared towards our folks on the phone who are coming from the chemical industry. It is an example from Dominion Color Corporation, which is a Canadian company manufacturing and exporting different chemicals. And they did a fantastic job in monitoring and identifying early coming restrictions in the EU. And they actually realized that two of their chemicals that they were exporting in large quantities in the EU were going to be restricted. And because they were so early and proactive, that gave them time to really think strategically about it and to decide on the next step. And what they decided basically is to request an authorization for the continued use. That paid off because today they are the only company allowed to commercialize these chemicals in the EU for the next couple of years. So really it secured their market there. So this brings us to the end of my presentation, but I want to leave you with a couple of takeaways. So when we look at the CETA, Canada and EU Free Trade Agreement, basically what we realize, there are on one hand new market opportunities with no EU import tax on most goods made in Canada, customs and trade facilitation, and access to new markets. And on the other hand, we have higher market expectations with high environmental regulations on manufactured goods, environmental enforcement on imports that is scaling up, and more conventional chemicals regulated or restricted in the EU than in Canada. The difference really that will help you to fully leverage the new opportunities brought by CEPA and avoid any environmental compliance risk is really to implement a proactive environmental management. And we hope this presentation really helps you see the value and understand also what are the first steps there. With this, I thank you and I pass the ball to Jean.
Thank you very much, Alex. As usual, always a pleasure to talk about all this technical environmental regulation information and providing this to our audience and listeners. What I take away, I guess, myself, not being as knowledgeable in the matter as you are, is of course the risks and penalties. We deal, and I personally deal with a lot of businesses that understand the opportunities on the market, understands there are risks in doing any business anywhere, but specifically here, and I guess the Sony case was really an eye-opener for me at least. You can lose quite a lot of business through, of course, the extended amount of time that you need to fix the issues. If you go to a country in the EU, in this case, with a product that's not compliant, you can have your product stopped at the border, and of course be liable if you have a contract and an obligation. So there are additional costs of that are legal costs, their management costs, management fees. There's redesigning of the product also, I think, is an issue. And of course, we tend to forget that, but that's also reputation as a company. You go in as an organization, if you're well prepared and you've really thought this in advance, you will be perceived as a company that is capable to adapt to new markets. And that is, of course, much needed. It's hard to enter those markets, and it takes time and a lot of effort. And just with some issues like that, you can lose all the effort quite quickly. So they're a very important case and very important risks to be taken into account. Again, Alex, I really want to thank you for this inside information you've provided today. And hopefully our listeners, well, I can see from the questions we have, listeners were listening, and of course are asking quite a few questions. Just a reminder before we go that a few things, a few takeaways. The presentation will be posted on our website. So this is quite important for you to know that the presentation contained a lot of information today, and it will be provided and posted on our website. We will send you, following this webinar, the links to download a copy of our presentation. If you need to have also a live broadcast or webcast, we can make that available for you. Just let us know. We'll be more than happy to provide this information to you. The other information that you have to take away is that the Q&A, the question session, some of the questions are extremely relevant. Unfortunately, we might not have time to answer them all, and we'll jump to them right away. But be sure, be reassured and rest assured that we'll provide a feedback to you as well, and we'll provide the appropriate link. Next webinar will take place, likely in about a month's time, as our other webinars are taking, more or less the frequencies every month or month and a half. So we'll keep you posted on the webinar date. So without further ado, we'll jump into the questions. And I have one very interesting question here from our audience. Alex, what are the existing exemptions? So please, Alex, can you answer that for us?
Thank you, Jean. Thank you again, everybody. So this is a tricky question. It is a very broad question. So what I would say here is just that each piece of legislation is obviously very different, and only a detailed assessment of each case could actually give the right answer there. But I will illustrate as an example. I would illustrate this with the ROS directive. So in the ROS directive, as we saw earlier, it applies to electric and electronic equipment. However, there is a list of exempted goods that is temporary, and there is also a list of out-of-scope applications. In the out-of-scope applications, they include the space applications, military applications, or the transport, the means for transport of goods and people. So in that case, it means that the aerospace, most of the airplanes, for instance, they would be exempted. However, to illustrate how tricky it is sometimes, although the aerospace the airplanes are exempted, the ground equipment that is used for maintenance or for otherwise managing the airplane is not excluded from that regulation. So that is very tricky.
Thank you, Alex. The next question that comes, we have quite a few, so unfortunately we won't be able to answer them all, but we're trying to go through the second one at least. Can you elaborate on how the changes in the guidance on manufactured goods can impact exporters?
Okay, so I touched a bit on that in my presentation. The most important thing is that in the past, I believe most of the companies, when they did the assessment on whether they have chemicals that have to be declared under REACH, they really looked at the overall end product, and at that level of detail, most of the times the chemicals used or anyways targeted by REACH are used in small quantities. So probably most of the time, everybody felt comfortable with not including them in any type of statement or declaration. However, this change in guidance actually brings the focus at the very small subcomponent level. And because of that, it means that you might encounter many more substances than what you would have expected in the past, because at the subcomponent level, some of them will probably be in quantities above the thresholds. So it really, the impact is an assessment, a more in-depth assessment needs to be done, and probably tracking of chemicals will become a bit more burdensome.
Very good. Third question here. What is the difference between an article and a manufactured good?
Another good question. Thank you for that. So it is a bit subtle because the terminologies are not the same in Europe and in Canada. In Canada, we would probably refer more to a manufactured good or a manufactured item for anything that actually is like a mouse, or it can be a car would be a manufactured good, etc. So I think everybody understands what a manufactured good is. In Europe, we use the terminology article, which actually means it means actually the smallest item that has a function and a form that is more important. A form that is more important to its main function than its chemical composition. So basically, that means a nut or a bolt is an article, and it's different from a pellet, a plastic pellet, or things like that, which the form itself is not very relevant. It is, though, to be noted that because of this European definition, it means that a car, for instance, is an object made of many articles. So all the nuts and bolts in the car would be considered an individual article on themselves. So I think I'm not going to stay too much more on this. It is a very complex question, so we might need to take that offline if needed.
Very good, Alex. It's true that some of those answers can extend forever, and we would, of course, invite our listeners to contact us directly. We'll be providing the contact information at the end. Another good question here from somebody who seems to have already been filling some of the data sheets on a globalized harmonized system. My safety data sheets are compliant with GHS. Will it also be compliant with REACH?
Yes, thank you. So for those not necessarily familiar with the acronym, GHS means the Global Harmonized System. Indeed, the Global Harmonized System is a new way of standardizing the safety data sheet format and also to a large extent the content. REACH is definitely aligned with GHS, and so is the new Canadian the new Canadian system. However, REACH has a difference. It is that it requires a lot more information on exposure scenarios, and it requires companies to really understand very well how their substances are used downstream. So even if a substance is used in an article downstream, you may still need sometimes to include it in your exposure scenario. So kind of that is in a very small nutshell the main difference.
Good. We have another client question on our customers here. My customers in EU did not ask anything. Is it possible that they don't know the new regulations?
Well, fantastic question, and it's a very tricky one. So a report from last year. As I was saying earlier, the EU actually does enforcement campaigns and audit campaigns regularly, and one of the latest campaign they had, in their report, they found out that imported goods were actually they were seeing more lack of compliance in imported goods than in domestic goods. So when they really went to they actually used the customs for this particular report, and they realized that importers are less prepared and they understand less, and they do not have the right documentation than domestic manufacturers. So as a conclusion of that report, actually the authorities they recommend to do more enforcing and put more focus on imported goods as we go forward.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think this is all we have today. We've been at 45 minutes into our webinar, and as promised to the audience, we won't take too much more of their time. We appreciate the time spent. We will send you again a link to our presentation posted on our website and a link to our Q&A feedback that will be provided, because there are more questions and we'd like to give you some answers. Just as a reminder, we also offer the complete package of tools that ensure to put in place the right processes for your compliance. We do that in-house here at Carbon Consult Group and be happy to help you with that. Without further ado, we wish you, thank you very much for having taken part of the webinar, and we wish you a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Alex.